Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It's with immense honor that I have the opportunity to welcome you all at the award ceremony of the International Congress of Historical Sciences International Prize of History, also known as the Historic Nobel Prize. Tonight, during the 23rd International Congress of Historical Sciences, Poznań 2020-2022, the prize will be awarded for the third time. It will be awarded to Professor Sanyaj Subrahmanyam. First and foremost, I am pleased to welcome hosts of this event, Professor Catherine Orell, the President of the International Committee of Historical Sciences, Professor Andrea Giardina, the Honorary President of the International Congress of Historical Sciences, and our Honorable Laureate, Professor Sanyaj Subrahmanyam. We are highly honored by the presence of esteemed guests. I would like to extend a special welcome to Her Excellency, Madame Nagma Mohammed Malik, the Ambassador of India to Poland. I warmly welcome also the members of the board of the International Committee of Historical Sciences and members of the International Committee of Historical Sciences. I warmly welcome also Professor Rafał Witkowski, who is the Vice Rector of Adam Mickiewicz University. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now hand over the floor to Professor Catherine Orell, the President of the International Committee of Historical Sciences.
Witam Państwa w Teatru Polskiego. Et maintenant, je vais parler un peu en français, puisque vous allez écouter deux communications en anglais. Et donc, je vais me permettre de vous parler quelques minutes en français de ce prix international de l'histoire. Comme vous le savez, il n'y a pas de prix Nobel pour les historiens. Il y a un prix Nobel pour les écrivains. Alors, beaucoup d'entre nous, évidemment, sont aussi des écrivains. Certains écrivent même très, très bien. Mais nous ne pouvons pas prétendre, par notre profession, au prix Nobel de littérature. Il a donc été décidé de créer notre prix Nobel à nous, que nous appelons donc the International Award for History. Et c'est un prix qui est tout jeune, puisque le premier prix a été remis au congrès mondial précédent en Chine, à Jinan, en 2015, à Serge Grozinski. Ensuite, nous avons décidé de reproduire ce prix à chaque assemblée générale et à chaque congrès du CISH. Parce que si nous attendions 5 ans entre deux événements, entre deux prix, nous craignons que l'on nous oublie. Et donc, nous avons décidé d'avoir une régularité assez importante pour le prix. Comme nous avons dû malheureusement remettre ce congrès 2 ans de suite, il va de soi que notre collègue Sanyaj Subrahmanyam aurait dû le recevoir il y a 2 ans. Donc nous avons tout décalé et c'est pour cela que vous êtes maintenant ici dans ce magnifique théâtre pour regarder cette cérémonie du prix. Nous avions eu entre-temps donc une assemblée générale en 2017 à Moscou et à l'occasion de cette assemblée générale, nous avions donc remis notre 2e prix international de l'histoire au médiéviste hongrois Gábor Klanitzáy. Donc, vous assistez ce soir à la 3e remise du prix. Donc, vous pourrez témoigner d'avoir été parmi les premiers à voir cette tradition que nous espérons devenir fort longue se créer. Donc, je signale aussi à nos distingués membres que bientôt, dans quelques mois, ils recevront un appel à candidature donc, pour le prix suivant, qui sera remis à la prochaine Assemblée générale à Tokyo en 2024. Et un petit détail, le prix fonctionne comme le prix Nobel, c'est-à-dire que c'est le secret absolu sur les candidats. Donc nous taisons absolument sur le nombre de candidats, leur identité, vous ne saurez jamais rien. Le bureau du CISH est tenu de rester absolument silencieux sur ces questions. Voilà, donc, Votre Excellence, Madame l'Ambassadeur, chers amis, chers membres du bureau, chers membres du CISH, chers invités, chers comités organisateurs du congrès de Poznań, maintenant, eh bien, je vais dire que je déclare ouverte cette cérémonie de remise du prix international de l'histoire et je vous remercie de votre attention.
I would like to give the floor to Professor Andrea Giardina, the Honorary President of International Committee of Historical Sciences, who will give the laudation for Professor Sanyaj Subrahmanyam, the winner of the CISH International Prize of History. The floor is yours.
Born in New Delhi on 1961, Sanyaj Subrahmanyam earned his PhD in economics in 1987 with a dissertation on economic history at the University of Delhi. The first part of his working career was spent teaching economic history and comparative economic development at the same institution, where he was eventually named professor of economic history on 1993. From 1995 to 2002, he was directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, where he focused on the economic and social history of early modern India and the Indian Ocean world. In 2002, he was appointed as the first holder of the newly created chair in Indian history and culture at the University of Oxford. This extremely high-level international curriculum continued in 2004 at the University of California in Los Angeles, where he currently teaches courses on medieval and early modern South Asian and Indian Ocean history, the history of European expansion, the comparative history of early modern empires, and various aspects of world history. Professor Subrahmanyam is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and corresponding fellow of the British Academy. He was awarded with the Infosys Humanities Prize, the Prix Martin Oblet, the Dan Davis Prize for History. He holds honorary doctorates from the University of Calcutta and the Université Catholique de Louvain. Since the written text of my laudation has been distributed, I must specify that I will not read it word for word, and that there will be some major changes. In particular, I will not repeat all the bibliographic references in full. The order of my speech has also been changed from what appears on the first page of the brochures. Lastly, in a desperate attempt to present in 25 minutes the vast work of a scholar who has addressed various fundamental themes, after having exposed the essential data of his academic prosopography, I will now proceed by adding to the text that has been distributed a division into paragraphs corresponding to the topics that I have selected. Point 1. a passage to Europe between continuity and ruptures. The early part of Professor Subrahmanyam's career, before his move to Europe and then the United States, was dedicated to the study of the economic and political history of India and the Portuguese Empire between the 16th and the 18th centuries. His output at the time, in addition to dozens of review articles and chapters in edited books, included at least 4 books whose titles you can find in the brochure, page 2. During the course of his rise to eminence among the most distinguished and influential historians of our era, Subrahmanyam has constantly broadened the horizons of his research, writing fundamental works on political history, social history, cultural history, historiography, history of mentalities, as well as literature and art. In all his works, boundless versatility and curiosity are coupled with a high degree of intellectual coherence. It would, however, be a mistake to view Professor Subrahmanyam's passage to Europe as a moment of rupture in his intellectual trajectory, both because the brand of economic history he practiced in Indian universities was always receptive to the contribution of political and cultural history, and because the new avenues he has explored in the second part of his career have never led him to abandon the interests of his younger formative years in India. Professor Subrahmanyam thus willingly speaks of himself. While the historical community, I am sure, continues eagerly to hope for Subrahmanyam's autobiography, he has often been approached by colleagues and journalists and has never shrunk from dialogue or from answering the most varied questions. Importantly, his comments reveal implicitly or explicitly a self-portrait colored most strongly by shades of continuity. Indeed, those wishing to understand the personality of this protagonist of the contemporary intellectual stage should take care not to overlook the complexity and fertility of the connections that link the historian and professor at Oxford, Paris, and Los Angeles with his native land. Il faut lire en particulier his leçons indiennes, itinéraire d'un historien de Lisbonne, Paris, Los Angeles, Paris 2015. Professor Subrahmanyam does not have 2 homelands, one of which is sentimental and the other dramatic, in the manner of Cicero in De Legibus, but rather 2 homelands where intense intellectual activity reigns and where he exercises in equal measure his creativity, his critical faculties, his genial anti-conformism. The second point is so I think Subrahmanyam in the intellectual diaspora. This point requires considerable attention insofar as it relates to the mistaken impression that Sanyaj Subrahmanyam is one of the many representatives of the so-called intellectual diaspora movement. The fact is that he actually left India rather late relative to many of his colleagues around the age of 35, and has never ceased to be active in the country of his birth. This is particularly important. Publishing in journals, participating in research projects, and maintaining an active relationship with younger scholars. Perhaps one of the keys to Subrahmanyam's success should be located in the ways in which he has inhabited the spaces of Western academia. As a fully integrated participant, a celebrated and admired pioneer in the study of world history on the one hand, and on the other as an incompletely acculturated foreigner. The fact of his never having been fully acculturated to Western academia from an early age has turned out to be what we might call a happy accident. I still find, Subrahmanyam said in 2015, many of the conventions that other intellectuals from India working in the United States universities accept easily, I find them quite detestable, including the ghetto mentality of many of the Indian intellectuals themselves and the obsession with the politics of ethnicity. This characteristic feature of his intellectual formation have allowed Subrahmanyam to propose an original reconsideration of the tradition within notions of global history developed, and to frame the long, slow evolution of such history as a minority phenomenon, a kind of Oppositionswissenschaft. Aware of this tradition, Subrahmanyam refuses to claim any sort of dominant role for the methodologies he himself employs. He has stated his discomfort with identifying himself as a historian of India, of Portugal, of Great Britain, or the Low Countries, and affirmed his profound belief that his way of doing history will never supplant histories conceived on a regional, national or continental scale. Je suis également convaincu que l'on peut même trouver de nouvelles synergies en combinant ces variétés d'histoires sous le même toit. These are words we read in the leçon inaugurale prononcée le jeudi 28 novembre 2013 au Collège de France et publiée en 2014 sous le titre « Aux origines de l'histoire globale ». Il y a aussi une traduction italienne. Third point, Subrahmanyam and the polyphony of historical research. Already in this early period, his numerous co-authored and co-edited books and papers testify to a characteristic feature of Subrahmanyam's scholarly modus operandi, one that recurs across the full arc of his career, a pronounced inclination towards collaborative projects that grow out of intellectual exchanges and the exploration of troves of previously unknown or underexploited sources. Among the 2 or 3 inspirations for his work, Subrahmanyam has cited, first of all, affinity and friendship. Affinity and friendship. A lot of my work, he said, is done in the context of collaboration. And this is the chemistry that motivates me, the chemistry that motivates him. I talk constantly to my friends and collaborators and have an enormous telephone bill every month. Collaborative works also provides some kind of real check of quality. 2 key expressions, a motivating chemistry in this collaboration and a check of quality. This way of writing history has provoked criticism from historians convinced that sole authorship is an impeachable achievement and that its absence a grave deficiency. The riposte of Narayana Rao, David Schulman, and Subrahmanyam itself in the course of a lively debate about the important volume Textures of Time, Writing History in South Asia, represents of a model of intellectual solidarity. It is one more reason for us, the authors said, to return to the fray and also to promote the cause still so unfashionable in history. It's true, of course, it's so unfashionable this way, of collaboration and joint authorship. The author is not dead. He or she may now have been reincarnated with 3 heads instead of 1. The quote comes from History and Theory 2007. It is a message of liberation. Historians' polyphony can be a higher form of expression than monody. Above, when the topic of research presents particularly elevated levels of difficulty and novelty. I believe, I can affirm that this prevalence of the plural over the singular is also connected to that concrete and ideal aspiration to always keep open collaboration with colleagues and young scholars from other countries, and in particular from his native land. Point 4, Sanyaj Subrahmanyam and the auto-orientalism. To criticize the nationalism of others while unconsciously falling back into one's own is something that can happen even to the most illustrious historians. Also in this case, the lesson of the great historian whom today the International Committee of Historical Sciences rewards proved to be decisive. With the critical acumen and strong polemical bent that typify his thought, Subrahmanyam has systematically revealed how widely the insidious attractions of a national sentiment continue to compromise historians' objectivity. Among the many intellectual battles he has waged, perhaps the most important centers on the problem of the relationship between history and colonialism. According to some Indian historians, history itself, conceived as the exclusive product of Western culture, is useless or even pernicious for those who have lived without history and who should have the right to experience this absence as the expression of an uncorrupted culture. Subrahmanyam has detected in such attitudes the consequence of a sort of auto-orientalism, or the orientalization of the East itself, which is especially typical of some scholars' working in the fields of subaltern studies and post-colonial studies. With a rare ability to move among myriad cultural tradition and historiographical environments, he has demonstrated that every culture writes history in the discursive register that prevails in its literary traditions, and that Indian cultures were able to historically articulate their past long before British colonialism exported Western historiographic practices. The fifth point is the one that more than any other identifies with the intellectual personality of Professor Subrahmanyam. We could title this point with two simple and bright words: connected histories. Subrahmanyam has undertaken research on 3 continents: Asia, America, and Europe. He has direct experience of many cultures, and he has acquired the tools and languages needed to study them, becoming a master in the art of establishing connections. Like the historian Ogre de la légende qui flaire la chair humaine, the ogre of fairy tales who smells human flesh, evoked by Mark Bloch, he sniffs out with peerless acumen all the phenomena that illustrate the notion of connected histories, and all encompassing concept for interpreting historical change on both a large and small scale, and in so doing challenges traditional historical framework. Connected history has proved to be a concept as polemical, particularly in relation to global history, as it is creative. National history and shoddy relativism, Subrahmanyam suggests, are two intimately related things. Our purpose, he said, would be to transcend and bypass the conventional divisions imposed by the rather arbitrary way in which historians are normally trained, so as to redraw geographical boundaries in an innovative way. This does not mean we replace one set of rigid boundaries, say the nation state, with another. Rather, the geographies have to be as flexible and varied as the problems. The following step, which is the really difficult one, is to multiply and read across archives and other primary sources, in keeping with the complexity of the problem. This is why it is easy to brandish connected history as a slogan, but rather more difficult to execute it in reality. These days, there is quite a lot of fake connection history around, in which historians pretend to read materials and archives that they really have not mastered. The sixth point, global history, microhistory, and biography. One of Subrahmanyam's most significant contributions to contemporary historical thoughts concerns the global dimension of microhistory. Along these lines, there is the powerful impulse he gave to the renewal of the genre of biography. This is an extremely important contribution. The study of lives of individuals has become a key for investigating the development of various aspects of the modern world. His biography of Vasco da Gama, while a great success, has also provoked harsh critical reactions by inflaming the national sensitivity of many, but not all, Portuguese scholars. The book is, as everybody knows, is The Career and the Legend of Vasco da Gama. The dialogue between macrohistory and microhistory, macrohistory and microhistory, applied to the genre of biography, ensures the most original results when it includes not only the story of members of the elite, for example, the globe-trotting careers of imperial functionaries and missionaries, but also, and perhaps above all, the less visible but no less important lives of the marginalized and subaltern. Among the book indicated page 10 of the brochure, see in particular three ways to be alien, travels and encounters in the early modern world, 2011. Seventh and last point, Polyglot Archives. Subrahmanyam's linguistic talent is exceptional among the historians of our times. His knowledge of Tamil, Hindi, and Urdu, Persian, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, German, Dutch, and other languages allows him wide access to original documentation and provides rigorous philological grounding for his historical studies. It is the product of supreme determination and uncompromising will deployed in order to achieve the level of professional competence deemed necessary for the practice of authentic world history. These efforts have allowed him to explore documents dispersed in an ocean of archives that had never previously come to the attention of world historians, but they also offer a response to one of the crucial problems of world history and global history, that being the prevalent reliance of these disciplines on the use of the English language. The working habits of Professor Subrahmanyam have thus imparted to colleagues and especially to thousands of young scholars setting out in these fields of study a valuable and inevitable lesson. They indeed invite us to reflect on standards of professional conduct in a post-Eurocentric historical epoch, and on the need to respect all the cultures with which historians aspire to engage. On the occasion of the French translation of Europe's India, Wars, People, Empires of 2017, Subrahmanyam insists on the epistemological ruptures that still endure in the academic sphere. Une coupure s'est produite entre des historiens formés en histoire européenne, souvent assez médiatisés, qui se perçoivent comme des penseurs et des entrepreneurs de l'histoire globale, et des spécialistes considérés comme des Sherpas, portant le fardeau de la traduction et de l'érudition. C'est dommage. It is an invitation not to lose the holistic dimension of the historian's craft, even when the spaces involved are global. And from here springs the kind of scholarly freedom that shines from every word we read in the great works of the historian we are celebrating today. Allow me to conclude a consideration that I hope corresponds to the feelings of many. Historical contingencies meant that this award took on particular meanings permeated by unpredictable emotions. A few kilometers from this theater, few hundred kilometers from this theater, people die in a terribly unjust and ferocious war. And as this happens, a community of historians, the most representative community of general community of historians, gathers in this specific place, also through the web, to celebrate a great historian who has dedicated his life to investigate the entire dramatic pentagram of connected histories. It is certainly a symbolic coincidence, of course, but as we see in the history of man, symbols are very powerful forces. Thank you for being with us today in this place, dear Professor Subrahmanyam. Your very presence contains in itself a hope. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the awards ceremony. I request Professor Catherine Norel and Professor Andrea Giardina to present the medal to Professor Sanyaj Subrahmanyam, the winner of the CISH International Prize of History. Professor Sanyaj Subrahmanyam, please accept my heartfelt congratulations and let me invite you to take the floor and give us the lecture entitled Why Connected Histories? Some Reflections. The floor is yours.
Dunque, per cominciare, grazie mille Andrea per gentilezza e queste parole. I'm not going to speak in various languages and confuse the whole issue of connected histories even more than it already is sometimes confused. So let me stay with, alas, the imperial language of our times, English. And in English, let me begin by sincerely thanking the Prize Committee of the International Congress of Historical Sciences for having bestowed this singular honor on me. Now, as you all know, this ceremony was supposed to have taken place 2 years ago, and it has been delayed by the unprecedented pandemic conditions in which we've been living. It's a matter of great contentment for me that we are able to meet face to face at last, even if the world has yet to return to normalcy. Now, where to begin? I would like to obviously to take this occasion to address a certain way of doing history that is frequently associated with me, namely connected histories. And in honor of the next conference, I also note a book which has used a version of connected histories edited by 2 colleagues in Jewish history, David Ruderman and Francesca Bregoli. So, let me start, actually, thinking about this thing called connected histories with a historical vignette. Towards the end of the Islamic lunar month of Muharram, in the year 962 Hijri, which would have been December 1554 on the Christian calendar, the Ottoman admiral and intellectual, Sayyidi Ali Rais, found himself in the city of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, it's in Western India, putting the final touches to his work, not this one that you see, but another called Kitab al-Muhit, the Book of the Ocean. Sayyidi Ali had not intended to be in Gujarat, and he only found himself there because of the vagaries of navigation, having suffered a shipwreck in a massive storm while trying to take his fleet around the Arabian Peninsula from Gwadar in modern-day Pakistan to Yemen. Though he was an experienced sailor in the Mediterranean, where he had served with the celebrated Khaireddin Barbarossa, the Ottoman admiral was clearly unfamiliar and rather ill at ease in the more easterly waters in which he found himself. This is what seems to have motivated him to write this text based on what he calls having discussed nautical matters day and night with the pilots and mariners who were on board his fleet during about 8 months. And he was, with remarkable ingenuity, able to lay his hands on several important geographical works in Arabic by earlier writers, whether classical or more recent. Now, as he tells us again, quote, "It was extremely difficult to maneuver in the Indian seas without such works, since the captains, commanders, and sailors who were not experienced in these maneuvers always need a pilot." Constituted as a companion volume to his much better-known travel text called Mirat al-Mamalik, Mirror of Kingdoms, this text, the Muhit, is a textual tribute, if you like, by the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. and an admission that to know the one is not to know the other. So let me draw the obvious lesson here then. Every oceanic space needs its own histories, just as it needs its own navigational treatises. Neither the Mediterranean nor the Atlantic can provide a simple model to be imitated, however much some historians have been tempted to do so in the past half-century. The reasons for this may be evident, but they'll bear rehearsing. The Mediterranean was a relatively small water body, which is 1/30th of the surface of the Indian Ocean. It has only two limited points of exit into the Black Sea and the Atlantic. It could sometimes be dominated by a single political system, and given its oblong shape, it was relatively easy to traverse from north to south, maybe more complicated from east to west. As a consequence, the Mediterranean was the theater for a particular set of dense crisscross interactions, which were, as we know, the point of departure for Fernand Braudel's exploration of it as a historical object of study. And here, too, you see two contrasting visions of the Mediterranean. On the one hand, Braudel's multi-archival exploration, of course, with some notable missing parts, which is to say the Islamic archives are missing in Braudel, and the Islamic texts are missing in Braudel. And then on the other hand, this quite extraordinary work by Shlomo de Goitein, which is in fact an attempt to take one archive, the Geniza of Cairo, and write a very complex history on its basis. So two different visions of an ocean based on two different strategies of two different historians. Now, the Atlantic, on the other hand, poses problems of quite a different order. For long centuries, that is at least until Iberian Empire building in the 15th century, the eastern and western shores barely maintained any form of regular contact. And even after 1500, the ocean as a whole showed little sign of coherence. And as even enthusiasts of Atlantic history have admitted, there are serious issues posed by what one author has called the real disjunctions that characterize the Atlantic's historical and geographic components. So as a consequence, Atlantic history has usually been divided into various segments corresponding to the various European empires. Furthermore, in the 3 centuries from 1500 on, the relationship between the two seaboards remained deeply asymmetric, resembling neither the Mediterranean nor the Indian Ocean in this respect. So let me turn to my main spatial object for the first part of the talk, which is the Western Indian Ocean, or what is sometimes called the Bahr al-Akhzar, the Green Sea. And since histories must begin somewhere, this one might as well commence in the kingdom of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, a small but complex maritime space centering on a tiny and very singularly arid island called Jarun, which had a strikingly, as you can see here, multicolored array of soils. Though the island was an ancient site of human habitation, it only became the center of a kingdom sometime around 1300, at a time when the Mongol Ilkhanid dynasty dominated the mainland to the north after having ended the career of the Abbasid Caliphate, or at least the most important part of the career, leaving aside the Rump Caliphate, which later on emerged in Cairo. So Jarun's immediate neighbor further up the Persian Gulf was the larger island of Kashmir. But that larger island was not as strategically located. So Jarun and Hormuz eventually became the dominant entrepot of this period from 1300 onwards. And this is testified to by the great traveler of the 14th century that many of you will know and recognize, the Moroccan alim Ibn Battuta, who seems to have visited it on at least 2 occasions, on his way to India and on his way from India. Now, Ibn Battuta noted that this was a new town that had been created as opposed to an older center which had been on the mainland. And he claims that it was a fine, large city with magnificent bazaars, and it is a port for India and Sindh, from which wares of India are exported to the 2 Iraqs, Fars and Khorasan. This city then became the residence for Sultan, despite the fact that it was extremely unpromising. Drinking water for daily consumption had to be imported from the mainland. In spite of this, it grew to have a population of 50,000 and eventually became a extremely impressive center, which would continue to have this important role all the way up until the early 17th century, when it was eventually displaced by the mainland city of Bandar Abbas, created by the Safavids. Now, this initiative to build up map Jarun and make it the center of a political system is a very interesting initiative for a number of different reasons. There's a significant role played by slaves. So in fact, it seems that although there is a dynasty, there were two enterprising former Turkish slaves who are called Bibi Mariam and Bahauddin Ayaz. And these people, in fact, in the turn of the 14th century, are the people who decide that since they don't want to be dominated by the Mongols in the mainland, that they are going to set up this kingdom. And this is then eventually consolidated by other people. Now, Hormuz's career is actually something which requires delving in all kinds of sources. It's something which is very difficult to do on the basis of a single archive alone. So it's in fact an excellent candidate for doing a kind of connected history, if you will. So we begin with sources like Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, or the Persian texts, and including the dynastic chronicles of the Ilkhanids. But then for the 15th century, for a good part of the 15th century, when Hormuz has emerged, as you can see, this is this rather curious shape. To the north is a little fortified center, then there's the city, and then there's the south where there are mountains and areas of very limited population. And the most important set of sources that we have for the 15th century, in fact, are the Chinese sources. And it's the Chinese sources which actually effectively give us a real sense of the importance of this center. In fact, in the last, let's say, 15 or 20 years, it's particularly interesting also that archaeology has provided us a kind of supplement to the textual materials because, in fact, large collections of Chinese ceramics, for instance, have been found in both Hormuz, but especially on Kashmir, the island which is sort of just down the road from there. So these Chinese sources include the famous text of Ma Huan, and its sort of versions that come from somewhat later. The Ma Huan was the translator of this Chinese expedition, which some of you would recall is an expedition mounted by the Ming dynasty, but in fact where the chief admiral, Zheng He, is a Muslim and a eunuch, as it happens, from Yunnan, so from the border area with Burma, and Ma Huan himself was also a Muslim, which is also an interesting fact because on account of this, he actually is able to give us a greater sense of the Muslim aspect of this island, but also, for instance, he has information concerning the Hajj, concerning Mecca, concerning the Hijaz, which had he not been a Muslim, he would not have been able to provide us. Now, a large part of what I'm saying is based on a point of departure, which is, for me, extremely significant. And that is the work of a very great, but unfortunately somewhat neglected French historian who was active from the 1950s to the 1990s, which was the French historian Jean Aubin. And you see here the Persian translation of his work on Hormuz, which is Mamlakat Hormuz, which is Le Royaume de Hormuz au XVIe siècle in French. Now, Aubin was someone who, for me, represented at a certain level a kind of an almost impossible level of erudition to be attained. Right? This was somebody who, in order to work on Hormuz, for instance, mobilized sources in Arabic and Persian and Portuguese and Italian. And of course, he didn't bother to deploy some of the languages that he knew for other occasions. For instance, Serbo-Croat was not of great use for the study of Hormuz, and neither was Swedish, which he had for a time learned in order to discuss the connections between Portuguese humanists of the 16th century and the ecclesiastical hierarchy of Uppsala. So we are talking about someone who, as I said, set the bar almost impossibly high, but there we have it. And a place like Hormuz is an excellent place, as I said, to begin to consider all of this. It's excellent in and of itself for what it tells us about the Persian Gulf. But it's also, for instance, extremely important because of what it tells us about India. Because, in fact, the 15th century, as many of you may realize, is a very frustrating century for historians of India because it's a moment when there are not a lot of historical sources which are available because of the fact that the great consolidation of historical sources begins in the 16th century with the creation of the Mughal Empire. And before that, in the 13th and 14th century, there are sources. And we have this gap in the middle. And so in this moment, we actually have to turn to sources that come from the Iranian world and from the Persian Gulf. And that is something which, again, historians of India, because of their sort of habitual formation and their bad habits, are not in the habit of doing. They do not consider it normally necessary to turn to a region which is a neighboring region in order to seek the sources with which to write their history. So this is what we have to think about. And the fact is that if we turn to these sources are many and varied. Some of them include sources which have to do with the Timurids who were ruling Iran in the 15th century, such as, for instance, the great Timurid universal chronicler, Abdulrazak Samarkandi, who actually wrote about relations between the Timurids and Egypt, the Timurids and Ming China, the Timurids and India. So already in his work, you have an enormous geographical horizon being covered. He leaves Europe out. But for the rest, you can actually see that he has a very large world before him. Or you have a text like this one, which in fact Aubin discovered in the 1950s and wrote about in the 1960s. And these are texts which often, to this very day, remain unpublished. So this is the work of an Iranian chronicler called Abdul Karim Nimdihi, who was born in southern Iran, was brought up in Hormuz, and then moved to India, spent a good part of his career in India, and wrote texts which are universal histories, but which have a good part of India in them. And there, again, lies the rub, because many Indian historians have not considered it worth their while to turn to the writings of an Iranian historian who spent a part of his life in India and a part of his time elsewhere. So again, here's someone whose life trajectory, as it were, already confounds us in some important ways. Now, I want to actually refer at this point to the fact that these are not merely texts that I'm talking about. It also has to do with, for instance, rather curious effects that we have sometimes when we're dealing with archives. Right? Now, here is one of a set of roughly 100 documents which is to be found in Lisbon. It's to be found in the National Archives of Lisbon. And, remarkable though it may seem, of these 100 documents, I would say roughly 80 of them had not been discussed or treated in any serious way by historians until 15 years ago. They had been talked about, they had been mentioned, some incredibly fantastical interpretations had been given to them by some rather extraordinary people, including a Syrian friar who converted to Christianity in the late 18th century, who called himself Frei João de Souza. And Frei João claimed that he had read these documents, and as a later scholar said, not only does he give us erroneous versions of the text, he gives us erroneous translations of a text he has invented. So you have to have a high level of talent to do that kind of thing. So you have these kinds of texts. Now, what is the problem with a document like this? The problem with a document like this is that it is in the wrong place. Right? So it is in a place where the people who go to this archive don't read these kinds of documents. And the people who read these kinds of documents don't go to these archives. Right? So what is this text? It's a small text, but it's a rather amusing little text, and this is what it effectively says, right? So it is a text for which you need a lot of context. Right? It is a text which is written to somebody who is very well known in the history of Portuguese expansion, which is Afonso de Albuquerque. Afonso de Albuquerque, who was the most important, significant Portuguese governor of early 16th century Asia. Some people would compare him, think of him as the equivalent of Hernán Cortés, although his conquests were obviously on a much smaller scale. So this is a letter written, therefore, to Afonso de Albuquerque. And this letter essentially is rather cryptic. I've given you the translation of the text in my written version. You can see it. And it talks about how the envoy of the viceroy, who was a superior officer to Afonso de Albuquerque, has come And it says that the writer of the text suspects Afonso de Albuquerque of treachery. It says that he is someone who is probably not dealing in an honorable way. He says things like, look at this letter. The original is for you. We know what it contains. Read the letter of your sultan. Listen and take the proper path. If you come to us, you will see the seal of your Sultan of Portugal. Right? And in this way, he's actually trying to tell him that, in a way, he should be, performing certain proprieties. He should be thinking about these matters in a reasonable way, and that there are conventions within which even Muslims and Christians should deal with one another. Now, because of context, we actually know who wrote this text, right? Because the text is not signed. And the person who wrote this text is a rather interesting character. He is the vizier, or what you could think of as something like the prime minister of the Hormuz Sultanate. Right? But who is he? This is a man writing in the early 16th century. So you are in Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, this island which has very little water and rather spectacular soil. But who might be the vizier of this island? Now, it turns out that the vizier of this island is a man who goes by the name of Haja Ata Sultani, as he sometimes signs himself. And we know from other contexts that he was a eunuch, but this is turning out to be a bit of a theme over here. But not only was he a eunuch, it turns out that, of all things, he was from Bengal. So what was a Bengali eunuch doing running the Sultanate of Hormuz and corresponding with Afonso de Albuquerque? And that is something which one is able to explore if we take a letter like this or a number of other letters that we have written by this man. Some of them are in Persian, some of them are in Arabic. They are normally written in a terrible grammar, but they're very interesting precisely because of that, because they preserve a level of orality. They suggest that even though this man had risen very high in the hierarchy, he did not possess a formal education in Persian and Arabic, which apparently did not prevent him from having a spectacular career. Right? And in fact, you get certain things which are very interesting in some of these letters. I worked on these letters together with my colleague Muzaffar Alam at the University of Chicago. And one of the things which Muzaffar said to me as he was reading these letters was he said that if you do not know Indian languages, you cannot understand these letters because the order of the sentence is all wrong. The sentence is basically organized as if the person is writing in Indian language. But it is actually not written in an Indian language, it's written in Persian or Arabic. So in a sense, you actually have to enter these documents through a different route. Right? And that is the reason why, at the end of the day, I talked about documents being in the wrong place and in front of the wrong readership, and therefore never actually being able to participate in the conversations which one should be having about the history, for instance, of the Indian Ocean. Just from a simple sort of exemplary point of view, let me point out something to you. Before this set of documents, there is actually practically no written documentation contemporary of an archival type in Persian or Arabic available to us from the Indian Ocean. So these are some of the first preserved documents that we have. We have some texts, but the texts are usually later copies. So this is actually one of the early material examples of what a document written in Arabic in the Western Indian Ocean actually looks like. Because even Batuta, we have, of course, texts by him, but they're not documents from the time. So it actually has a certain materiality and a certain importance, but then, again, the problem is getting to them and making sense of them by approaching them in what you might think of as the right way, right? So this is, as I said, the translation of the letter. He calls him Great Captain, Na Khuda Kabir, Afonso de Albuquerque, and he deals with him in this way. He's much more impolite in some other letters that he writes. At some point, he calls him rather brutally Haram Khor e Badshah Portugal, which is to say that you are a traitor, that you've eaten his salt and you've betrayed the king of Portugal whom you actually work for. These are interesting texts also for all kinds of other little details. For instance, you can actually see that the Arabic here starts, the Persian here sometimes starts taking on new words, right? So for example, when he refers to the viceroy, right, So the viceroy, normally you would call him the naib, or the nawab, the naib. But no, he doesn't call him the naib. He uses a word which doesn't exist in Arabic or Persian, which is the word Abu Zurrai. Right? He invents this term Abu Zurrai because why? It sounds like Ovicerai in Portuguese, right? So he's actually throwing in all these new words which are coming in to the usage. So just as Portuguese at this time is going to take on words from Malay, take on words from Arabic, take on words from Persian. In the case of Arabic, it was a long process, of course. But in the case, you actually have this mutual exchange in terms of languages and how matters go. Okay, so this is my first set of reflections and first set of examples, which is to show you how, so to speak, on the ground, with boots on the ground or boots in the mud or whatever you want to call it, one does a kind of connected history. You take a set of materials and you try to make sense of them. Often these are materials which, for whatever reason, may have been lying in plain sight, but have not actually been dealt with. And you try to actually deal with them in terms of context, in terms of trying to make sense of what they are. And from that little thing that you have, which is a handful, 40, 50 documents, you can then try to build up and try to construct a much larger story, which is, in a way, you could think of this as a strategy which resembles, let's say, Goitein's Geniza strategy. There's some resemblance, a family resemblance between these kinds of things that we could consider. Now, the question, of course, which is the second question which I want to ask you, is why have this new concept of this kind of intervention in terms of a notion of connected histories? Why wasn't what was around before good enough? Or enough for us to rest content. Now, I want to just remind you, if you'll permit me a mild autobiographical note, to go back to when I was trained as a historian. Right? So I was trained in India in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I was trained in the Department of Economics. And you can already see how long ago it was because departments of economics actually did economic history then. Right? How many departments of economics are there left which do economic history now? So that was a great tradition in Delhi at that time, and I studied that kind of economic history. So what was that kind of economic history that we studied at that time? And I want to remind some of you what it was like back in the day. So these were some of the books that were important for us, especially the book on the left that you see, actually written by someone who was an economist, actually a statistician, but trained to do economic history, which is Simon Kuznets. Kuznets, like many important figures of that time, actually came out of Tsarist Russia, but made his career in the United States, notably on the US East Coast. And he wrote a very large number of works, which were of a kind of social science history. And the social science history was very much influenced by ideas of modernization, very popular in the 1960s and 70s. And as you can see, almost every book that Kuznets wrote, with the exception of this one, used the term modern or modernization somewhere in the title. This was very important for him. And Kuznets had a very straightforward view of modernization. He thought that modernization began very clearly in a limited number of Western European countries, and then it was a diffusionist process. From there, it spread to the rest of the world. He has precisely one book which is called Rate, Structure, and Spread, where he's actually talking about how the modern economy is developed in one place in the world and then moves to other places in the world. Now, Kuznets was apparently influenced by someone who must have been his colleague in Harvard, Joseph Schumpeter, but he was obviously, at least to my mind, a much less sophisticated thinker than Schumpeter. And he actually generated a whole industry. So everybody was doing this kind of thing. How did the modern economy and modern society emerge? And this was pretty much something, as I said, which everybody, not only in the West, but everywhere in the world, learned to do at the feet of Kuznets and his disciples. Now, eventually, another historian, also born in Tsarist Russia, started, and also teaching in Harvard, as it happened, began to express some skepticism regarding this. And this was Alexander Gerschenkron, who tried to nuance this kind of analysis and who tried to make an argument about how we need to actually get away from this very mechanistic view of how things spread, how institutions are reproduced, how patterns of growth and change are reproduced, and so on. And he was, of course, not only opposed to Kuznets, but to someone who had an even more heavily ideological conception of modernity and modern growth and change, which was the great Cold Warrior Walt Whitman Rostow. I don't know how many of you would remember that name, W.W. Rostow, who was a great establishment figure in the U.S. At that time. So this was the kind of bread and butter for us, right? And this bread and butter, this kind of comparative history, which was either generated out of enormous data sets or generated out of, shall we say, very macro-historical reasoning at any rate, even affected people like me who were, after all, not really interested in the 19th and 20th centuries, which is where most of this work was concentrated. Because, of course, it's the 19th and 20th century, especially in the 20th century, that you find the data, you find the quantitative data, which allows you to run this. So even the people working, let's say, on the early modern, like myself, found ourselves confronting some version of this kind of comparative history, a comparative history very much located in a certain conception of modernization. And the version of comparative history located in relation to modernization, which was particularly influential for someone like me working on the Indian Ocean, was that which was a kind of a Weberian history. And that Weberian history, for instance, one of the most significant examples of this is a book which is so significant that they decided to publish it twice under different titles. So this is one title and one version published in Scandinavia, and then the University of Chicago published an even more popular version. It's by the great Danish historian, I will admit that he's a very important figure, Niels Steensgaard. And Steensgaard wrote this book, which is called The Structural Crisis in the European-Asian Trade, in which he presented a model according to which the actors in Indian Ocean trade were of two types. There were modern actors, we're talking about the 17th century here. There were modern actors who were essentially victorious eventually. And they were actors who had rational enterprises. These enterprises were oriented towards solving problems and using them and turning them to their own advantage, using flexibility and planning. So what are these modern enterprises? They are, obviously, for Steensgaard, the East India companies. Right? So the East India companies, the English, but especially the Dutch East India Company. If there is a hero in Steensgaard's writings, it is the Dutch East India Company, an unlikely hero. So that is on the one side. These are the people who are taking the Indian Ocean forward, who are taking it in the direction of a kind of modernity. So who is on the other side? On the other side, you throw in a whole bunch of people who he terms as essentially redistributive enterprises. So they include Muslim empires, all Muslim empires of the Indian Ocean, but they also include everything which is Catholic. So the Portuguese, obviously, the Spaniards counted a little bit, but not very much. So all of these are thrown into the view of the losers of history. Why are they losers? Because they have no flexibility in planning. They are characterized by corruption. They are characterized also by a kind of incapacity to address and resolve their problems. Right? Now, I should remind you that this is not a point of view necessarily simply of a Scandinavian historian who's sort of looking down at the world south of Scandinavia. No. On the contrary, this is the same view which I could show you in the work of many Portuguese historians writing in the same period. Right? The greatest Portuguese historian of that time, writing about the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, was a man by the name of Vitorino Magalhães Godinho. And if you read Godinho's work, he talks precisely in these terms. He talks about why did Portugal not become England, right? And he gives you an explanation for why Portugal didn't become England. It's because of irrationality, incapacity to create a bourgeoisie, all the familiar watered-down Weberian themes, right? And he tells you about this in very great detail. So there was a kind of a common sense. At this time, this book was published in 73, second version 74, of how to address these matters. It was a very clear world which was sort of divided. Somewhere, you might say there was a line which you could draw, I don't know where, in the middle of Europe. Obviously, as usual, France would pose a problem. Does it stand on the northern side or the southern side? There's always the great French issue in this matters. But in general, this was the way it was done. And essentially, what was driving the whole exercise was a comparative methodology, a Weberian comparative methodology in which you have these different enterprises, each of which is characterized, each of which is defined in its clearly stereotypical terms, and then you see, so to speak, and I'm not inventing this vocabulary, who are the winners and who are the losers of history. And of course, the winners are always right. So now, the interesting thing, however, is that when you start thinking about this, and when I started thinking about why did we actually get to do this kind of comparative history, and why was this kind of comparative history so popular at that time, even for historians of the Indian Ocean? And I realized that there were other people who were writing other histories of the Indian Ocean, or even of Europeans in the Indian Ocean at the same time, or even before. I mean, here was someone who had the privilege of meeting at the very end of his career, the very great American historian Holden Ferber. Holden Ferber was the person who pioneered work on English private trade in the Indian Ocean. He was the person who actually invented this subject. He wrote this enormously important book called John Company at Work. And in this book, he actually shows you what an immensely corrupt organization the English East India Company was. So to imagine that these are rational actors solving problems for profit maximization, when in fact you have someone who has actually written a 350-page book showing in enormous detail how every governor, every head of an establishment in the English East India Company was milking the enterprise dry and bilking the stockholders, it takes some doing, right? So this was the situation that we had. So we had this kind of contradiction in a way between the schematizers who had the comparative bent, and then you actually had the others who had done enormous archival-based work, which didn't quite go in the same direction. And of course, this eventually, in reflecting on this, I have gone back to the classic essay on comparative history, right? Which is Bloch's famous essay from 1928. And when you go back to that essay, you actually see some very interesting aspects of that essay. I mean, I sometimes feel that everybody who does history should be obliged once a year to read this essay. Right? Now, what does Bloch actually do in this essay on comparative history? So let's see a few things he doesn't do. One thing he doesn't do is he never talks about the world outside Europe. He doesn't seem to be opposed to the idea in principle, but he doesn't do it. Right? So that's one thing. Now, he also says, and I think this is important, he says, comparative history is not a new panacea. He says that very clearly, right? And he also then does something which is, I think, a great deal more intelligent than many later comparative historians have done, which is he says that we have to distinguish between two types of comparisons, one between societies distant in space and time, right? Things like James Fraser's Golden Bough come to mind, but also some of you may remember an extremely strange little book by the French classicist Marcel Détienne called Comparer l'incomparable, where he insisted that only things which have nothing to do with one another in space or time should be compared. And then, as Bloch put it, what he thought were the better comparisons between broadly contemporaneous and neighboring societies like France and Germany, or some part of France, some part of Germany, and so on. Okay? So he says that two conditions are necessary. There should be some similarity between the two cases, and there should be some dissimilarity between the two contexts, which is, for him, the point of departure for comparison. Without the first, there's no basis for comparison, and without the second, there's no interest in the comparison. Right? So remember that when Bloch is writing this in 1928, comparative history was still a pretty unpopular activity, and then it took off, and then it became, in a way, a tidal wave. And as it became a tidal wave, I want to list some of the difficulties that you see with the type of comparative history which is being produced in the subsequent period. So I'll give you 5 problems with comparative history that arose. Number 1, the idea that simple juxtaposition of 2 cases is somehow significant or reveals something hidden. Number 2, the use of comparison to reinforce a predetermined hierarchy between cases. And this is usually, almost always, accompanied by a sharply asymmetrical knowledge on the part of the historian of the 2 cases. Number 3, the reification of objects by exaggerating their uniqueness or specificity. Number 4, the repetitive and lazy use of the same units of comparison rather than varying the units of comparison. Right? And finally, the use of comparison for simple list making or creating typologies. For example, one can read books where people will tell you there are 7 types of cities, 11 types of religious systems, 14 types of empires, and so on and so forth. What good that does anybody remains a mystery. Some comparative historians in recent times have even begun fabricating statistical data and claim to have developed an index of social development for different societies over 10,000 years, 15,000 years. Where they get this data from? Who knows? So this was the reason why the comparative history that I grew up with was something that I was dissatisfied with, right? And that is the reason why I began to think that it might be useful to reconfigure the question of relationships, not to simply and always pass through comparison, but to pass through something else. And in fact, I have to say that it kind of came to head in an argument which I had with an American historian who wrote a book called Strange Parallels in 2 volumes, where he tried to take comparative history to to very great lengths, right? And he claimed that he could sort of list Eurasian societies and compare all of them, right? And he comes to conclusions like this. I'll just give you one of his conclusions. He says, in critical aspects, both synchronic and diachronic, I have found precious little difference between, say, France, Burma, Japan, and Vietnam. Now, I compare this to Carlo Ginzburg writing about Bloch, right? Here, Ginzburg says, Bloch evokes the persistent prejudice which identifies comparative history with the search for analogies, even the most superficial ones. However, the central point of comparative history, Bloch insists on the contrary, is to emphasize the specificity of the differences between the phenomena that are being compared, unquote. So clearly there are better and worse ways of also doing comparative history. So far as central propositions where connected history were concerned, okay, so let me at least lay out some of their central propositions and keeping an eye on the fact that I'm running to the end of my clock. So obviously, something which Andrea Giardina has already stressed is, for me, the problematic effect of nationalism and national history on how historical problems are created. This has a double effect. What it can do is it can obscure the importance of large spaces that actually greatly exceed national boundaries. But it also has another rather nefarious effect, which is to delegitimize certain small spaces which today don't happen to fall inside a single nation state. Right? And so they become nobody's baby. They become, for instance, if you want to study the history of a people who are today, and in the last 2-3 years, very much in the news, the so-called Rohingyas. Now, they are a community which lives essentially, or has lived historically, between what is today India, what is today Bangladesh, and what is today Burma. So, in fact, they are nobody's object. So you have the question of breaking down these spatial boundaries for one reason, and we need, as I said, to consistently think of fresh spatial parameters which are appropriate for our problems, rather than have a spatial parameter which is predetermined and then look for problems which fit the space rather than the other way around. And I remind you that this can again happen at all kinds of scales. So let me show you 2 recent books, right, which give you a sense of this. My colleague Sebu Aslanyan has written a book on the Armenian trading diaspora. In order to study the Armenian trading diaspora of based in New Julfa, which is today a suburb is in Iran, is in a suburb of Isfahan. He has actually had to consider these people in all kinds of spaces which run from Astrakhan and London to Arkhangelsk to Manila to Madras, and is able to show how, for instance, Armenians living in Madras in the 18th century were publishing texts which had a crucial importance on the emergence of Armenian nationalism. They were sitting in Madras in South India. Right? So that is an example of this. Or take this other book, which looks even more curious. It's the study of a single poet. And this poet, who is one of the greatest poets of the later medieval Persian world, Abdulrahman Jami, lived in the town of Herat. But if you actually trace the history of Jami, you can find links to Jami which will take you all the way from North Africa to Southeast Asia. He had readers, he had correspondents, he had people who translated him. So actually to do an intellectual history of this single figure requires you to consistently and repeatedly rethink what is the space of this figure. Clearly, it's not the space of Timurid Herat. It's not even the Timurid world. It's something much, much, much larger than that. And if you were to do the same exercise, let's say for the great Persian poet Hafiz or for Rumi, you would come to much the same conclusion. Now, as it happened, not long after I published the article on connected histories, it was taken up, and by an amusing coincidence, the person who took it up and took it in a certain direction was someone who was a previous recipient of this prize, my colleague Serge Gruzensky. At that time, we were teaching together, and we used to have a seminar that we taught together, which was called, in shorthand, we called it Amérique Asie, where we dealt with American and Asian history, pretending we didn't deal with European history. And in that context, he actually wrote an essay in the Annal, which you see over here, where he actually tried to take the connected histories idea and see what one could do with it to write imperial history. So that's been one usage that has been made of it. So he, for instance, made an argument, which I think is a perfectly sensible argument, where he said that you have the Spanish Empire, you have the Portuguese Empire. These empires actually have enormous connections and have a lot of things to do with one another, but because of the persistent nationalism of Portuguese historians and of Spanish historians, neither one really wants to talk to the other. And so he eventually, from that article, produced this book, which you see over here, Les Quatre Parties du Monde, where he actually tried to do precisely that, to try to look in the 16th and 17th centuries at what happens when you take two empires which are normally treated as separate entities and try to do them together. Now, my main objection to what he did is that it's too easy. And the reason for it is very simple, because let me remind you that anyone, frankly, who reads Portuguese can read Spanish. And anyone who reads Spanish can read Portuguese. It's not difficult at all. Speaking may be a different matter, but anybody can do this. Right? So in fact, it's only a certain, determined and desperate pig-headedness that kept the Portuguese and Spanish historians apart. Right? There was nothing really of the order of a real barrier. And I mean, frankly, how long did it take to take the train from Madrid to Lisbon, even back in the days of Salazar and Franco, in order to actually use the other person's archives? So, I believe that this is an interesting idea. It's one direction into which things were taken. But I think there are also other kinds of ideas, other kinds of directions into which it can be taken. Towards the end of the written text, I've mentioned the fact that there also have been some sort of levels of a little bit of passive resistance to connected histories. This morning, I was happy to receive an email from my friend Dipesh Chakravarti, who was here at the opening ceremony, to say that he had some disagreements with what I had said in my text. We shall discuss them eventually. But to my mind, subaltern studies, which came up also in the 1980s and 90s, was not very interested, finally, in connected histories, precisely because of the fact that I still feel, and perhaps Dipesh would disagree with me, that the subaltern studies still remains heavily invested in a nationalist history. How many subaltern historians of India actually work on non-Indian subjects? Or actually even really think about West Asia or Southeast Asia. The one exception, of course, is Chakraborty's equally distinguished colleague, Partho Chatterjee, who in his book on the black hole of empire actually does try to engage with some of the questions which are raised by a connected history. So there has been, shall we say, a certain level of resistance. There has been some positive response. There have been some people who have said, of course, that it is extremely difficult to do. And I must admit that this is indeed true. And just to end with a final example, let me just take a particular place, which I don't know how many of you have thought about. Let's think of the island of Sri Lanka, a little bit bigger than Hormuz, but still an island, just to the south of India. If you are writing the history of this island in the 16th century, what all do you need to figure and take into consideration? You have to, of course, think about the fact that this is an island which has a long Buddhist tradition. It has its own textual production. It has an encounter with the Portuguese who arrive on this island, and you have a large and substantial archive which is generated from this. But if you start actually peeling away the layers of this, you understand that Sri Lanka is connected to all kinds of other histories. It has very deep links to southern India. And you cannot understand Sri Lankan history without a very deep investment in South Indian history. But you also need to think about, for instance, Thailand. You need to think about Burma, because of the fact that in terms of religious circulation, in terms of the training of monks, in terms of the circulation of Buddhist objects, these were the world in which all of these materials circulated. And we can take, of course, a history of Sri Lanka and take it into many other very different directions. So, I'm aware that in these reflections of today, I've probably taken some of you quite far from your own preoccupations, whether in terms of space or time or theme. But I must ask your indulgence for this, and I take courage from the fact that I am, after all, speaking in the country of historians like Marian Malovist or Jan Kinevich, who were never, in their careers, afraid to explore distant and complex geographical horizons. So let me conclude then by quoting Bloch's celebrated essay. Let us cease, if you please, to speak endlessly between one national history and another without ever understanding each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture, Professor. I would like to thank you, Professor Catherine Orell, Professor Andrea Giardina, and you, the most important person during this event. And please take a seat in the audience and enjoy the second part of our event, of our ceremony. It will be a concert. Thank you.